I know some of us out there like, it's an inappropriate comic, but yeah, it's not really, it's not showing anything. All right, so again, we're going to be talking today about bone development. Where do these bones come from? You're not just all of a sudden, you know, going through as a fetus and you have all your bones. Most of them start off as cartilage. The making of bone from something else is known as ossification or osteogenesis. What does OSS or oste mean? What does the genesis mean? Making. Yeah, so we're making bone. That's the forming of bone. So it's a process of making bone tissue, whether it's in the osteons, whether it's compact bone. Now, making of bone from other, you know, either the hyaline or from a little membrane starts in the second month of development. So 8 weeks, bone is already starting to get laid down. So a little 8-week-old fetus, and I've got a picture coming up on our side. We've got a 12-week-old picture where you can see mostly cartilage and a little bit of bone, depending on, we'll see how well this shows up.
So you mean the second month when the baby is
Still inside, yep.
oh, okay.
Yep. Now, bone development just doesn't, you know, happen inside the baby or inside the mom as a fetus. We also have what's known as postnatal bone growth. This means after a baby is born, all the way up until 20-ish, you know, like 25 totally, bones are going to continue to grow. We're going to be adding new bone tissue, makes you taller, makes your feet bigger, all of that. That's going to happen after birth. And then throughout the rest of your life, you still have bone remodeling and bone repair if you did any damage to any bones. And so we're always going to have new bone forming somewhere. We're going to break some down, make new bone. Some of it's a lot of it if you're growing taller. Otherwise, we're just constantly remodeling our bone through the rest of your life. Now, there are 2 types of ossification or osteogenesis. The biggest one is endochondral ossification. What's endo mean? Within. Chondr? Cartilage. This is the part where bone is forming from cartilage. This is the majority of your skeleton. Almost all bones start off as cartilage, most specifically a hyaline cartilage. We call these cartilage bones. It forms, what I said, most of the bones of the skeleton. The only bones that don't form from cartilage are the ones in the next group. Your flat bones, such as the bones in your skull, and your clavicles, because they're just a weird bone. So it's pretty much, you know, neck down, all those other bones all started out as cartilage. All the other bones, those flat bones in the clavicles, they started off as a fibrous membrane. And we'll look at how we actually make long bones and bones that come from the cartilage and how that turns. And then we'll look how we can take that fibrous membrane and turn that into bone. So we're going to look at the 2 different ways. Again, the majority of your bones all start off as cartilage, but a few don't. A few start off as just a membranous or fibrous membrane. So the first one, the endochondral ossification. So again, this is most all the bones in your body below your skull, except the clavicles because they're weird. It begins late in the second month of development, so around 8 weeks in the womb, and we use hyaline cartilage models. So 8 weeks along, if we took an x-ray or an ultrasound and we looked at the fetus, their bones, although they're not bones yet, would look like bones. I'm just going to skip ahead just so you can see picture. This is at 12 weeks. We use cartilage models, which means they look like bones. That's not bone yet. And I'm like, it's hyaline cartilage that appears to be the shape of what the bone will be. This is the model, eventually what the bone will start to look like. So we just use cartilage models. The cartilage knows what shape to be, and eventually we're going to replace that cartilage with bone. Now we'll get into it. I'm like, this is 12 weeks, depending on the picture, and I'm like, your picture in your book, and I don't think I wrote it down. I'm like, you'll start to see it starts a little bit darker around the diaphysis. That's where bone is actually starting to get laid down. It gets laid down right on the edges of the diaphysis. I was going to say, I'm like, on my picture on here, it looks really nice, you know. Once I throw it up there, it becomes a little faded. You can look in the book, too. It's in there. Same picture. So we have to break down that hyaline cartilage before we can actually make bone. So we're going to take that hyaline cartilage, break it down, replace it with bone, and eventually we have all bones and no longer cartilage. So, whole long process of how this takes, how long or what is happening for us to go from cartilage to bone. So I'm just going to flip to the next picture because you've got this written in front of you too. So I'm like, this way I can just, as I talk, I've got a picture in front of you and picture in front of me that I can talk about. So it begins, the whole ossification part begins at what's known as the primary ossification center. Primary means what? The first thing. And the very primary ossification center is going to start right in the very center part of the diaphysis. So this is where ossification really is going to start, right in the middle of that diaphysis. Now, blood vessels are going to infiltrate the perichondrium. Now, what does that word mean, or where would you find the perichondrium? Surrounding the cartilage, because if you remember, periosteum, that's that layer that goes around bone. Perichondrium is the layer that goes around the cartilage. So there is cartilage. If I take out this little bone right here, before that, even that little bit of bone right there, all cartilage that surrounds it is your perichondrium. Once we start to get cartilage underneath and within that perichondrium, we now have blood supply going into the cartilage. Does cartilage have blood supply before this? No, your cartilage is avascular. It doesn't have a blood supply. But our bone has lots and lots of blood in it. So we need to get blood into that bone tissue, or what will become bone, so that blood vessels start getting underneath the perichondrium and getting into the cartilage. Once we start having blood there, now we can start bringing osteoblasts, because most osteoblasts eventually came from a blood cell, and we can start laying bone down as we break down the cartilage. So we're going to start, getting blood inside of our cartilage. We're going to start bringing in the osteoblasts. And why is it that we want osteoblasts? These are going to be the bone building cells. And what's going to start forming initially is a bone collar that goes just around the diaphysis. I always think it works as a collar. I'm like, the middle part of your bone, that's the diaphysis. It's the narrower part. It's where you put a collar on a dog, is the narrowest part around their neck. And I'm like, the diaphysis is kind of like the neck part of a bone. So we start forming a bone collar. We start laying down bone tissue around the edges of the diaphysis. And so you have to imagine, although you only see it on two sides, it goes around the whole part of the diaphysis. That's where we first start laying down that bone. So that's your bone collar forms around it. The central cartilage in the middle of the diaphysis is going to start to calcify. So we're going to start bringing, with that blood supply, calcium into this hyaline cartilage. And we're going to start laying down calcium. And the process of laying down calcium, it starts to break apart that cartilage that was there. So we're going to lay down cartilage, or lay down calcium, start breaking down the cartilage that's inside of there. Now, if we start breaking down the cartilage inside of there, what's it going to form? What do you think it's eventually going to form if we start breaking down this middle part? Yeah, the medullary cavity, which we'll start getting into. We're bringing in calcium into the whole hyaline cartilage, and we're breaking down that very middle part. At least the blood is helping break it all down. Then we have a periosteal bud that's going to get inside of that new empty cavity. And it's going to bring blood to the ends as we're starting to go longer and longer. And so it's starting to bring blood further and further this way. It's starting to bring blood further and further toward the top. We can also get new blood vessels that are going to say, well, hey, you're having a free-for-all in the middle. Let's go into the ends ourselves. So we have little epiphyseal blood vessels going into the ends. These blood vessels, again, are bringing osteoblasts that are going to lay down tissue. They're also going to help break apart the hyaline cartilage. Now, as this middle diaphysis part, it's all bone, and it's working its way up to the epiphysis, and the same thing is happening down here as it's laying down bone, you're eventually going to have an area where these two bone parts meet, and it stays as cartilage. What is that? Yeah, the epiphyseal plates, and or line if it's, not blue. This is where we're going to constantly maintain cartilage. We don't want all the cartilage to be gone. This cartilage is going to stay there until your long bones are done. Your long bones are done growing, approximately the age of 25. And your long bones are going to be continually growing longer and longer. And because bones start off as cartilage, we need to make sure we have that epiphyseal plate right there with cartilage right there. So we can add more cartilage. That cartilage will turn into bone. Your bones get longer, but that cartilage line or that plate always needs to stay right there. First, does anyone have questions on this? So it's really getting that blood supply in there, bringing in osteoblasts. We're going to break down cartilage, form that medullary cavity. More blood's going to infiltrate the ends. And you're eventually going to form spongy bones on the end. We'll lay down enough cartilage on the sides, or not cartilage, we'll lay down enough bone matrix on the sides to form the compact bone. But you're still going to have a little bit of cartilage left in the bones. The epiphyseal plate, where else other than the epiphyseal plate do you have some cartilage? Yeah, the articular cartilage, the very, very ends, you'll still have a little bit there. Again, we want that for protection of the bones at those regions. You're not having growth there, they're just protecting the bones. So that'll always be there. Now the other type, so this is all endochondral ossification. Starting off as that cartilage model and eventually turning into bone, whether it's compact bone or spongy bone. The other type of bone ossification, or deossification, is starting off not as cartilage, but as a fibrous membrane. And so again, this is going to form your flat bones of the skull, your frontal bone, the parietal, the occipital, the temporal bones, and the weird little clavicles. Again, instead of starting off as cartilage, we start off as the fibrous membrane, a fibrous connective tissue that's all made by something known as a mesenchymal cells. Now I'm just going to flip to my picture on here. Only like 4 steps on here. Yes, there's lots of words. You can read it all. I'm not going to read everything for you, though. Up on the very, very top where we start, my little purple squiggly ovally things, those are mesenchymal cells. They're the ones that are making some of this collagen fibers. Like, that's the fibrous membrane. It's fibrous. And the part that's making it is just a cell known as a mesenchymal cell. Now, for this fibrous membrane to turn into bone, the first thing that we have to have is a bunch of osteoblasts coming together. When you first get some osteoblasts coming together, so these are 6 osteoblasts right here, all hanging out next to each other, we now have an ossification center. This is where bone is going to start being laid down. Again, osteoblasts are the bone builders, whether it's endochondral or intramembranous. We start off as different material. And the bones will look a little bit different. So those osteoblasts are going to make something known as osteoid. They're going to release a substance known as osteoid, which just means it resembles bone. That's the name of osteoid. Osteoid is an unmineralized bone matrix. So it all is almost bone. It just needs the calcium and the phosphorus for it to actually turn hard. Over here you can see all of the white part that's in here, or the tannish part. This is all osteoid that has been calcified. So all that osteoid type material, that bone matrix, now it got its calcium, and we're starting to form something that looks like bone. So you have all these osteoblasts on the outside, constantly secreting osteoid. We lay down some calcium with it. We now have bone. What are the cool looking cells that it can be trapped inside of it? Those are on the outside. The ones that are in the inside. There's 2 of them. Osteocytes. These are osteocytes that they can get trapped inside of there, and they're going to help just maintain that calcified bone tissue as the cells get, or as the bone starts to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. So we're starting to get osteocytes found within some of that calcified bone matrix. Osteoblasts are going to continually make more and more of this osteoid, which gets calcified, which is why, yes, as babies are developing, lots and lots of calcium is necessary for all of this to happen. Then we start getting what's known as woven bone. It's not spongy bone yet. It's just called woven bone. Main reason why it's called woven bone, once we take, it's like we're taking all of this calcified bone matrix. Now we're going to bring blood vessels into it. And the blood vessels are going to infiltrate into that calcified bone matrix, creating little holes everywhere. They weave through the bone matrix, hence the reason why we call it woven bone. That's kind of the next part of Mike. So we got blood vessels now infiltrating that matrix. We now have something that looks like woven bone. It's not spongy bone yet, but it's getting there. The periosteum that's going to cover all of the bone starts getting laid down once we start having the blood vessels there. Then lamellar bone, which is another way of saying compact bone, starts getting laid down on the edges. And that woven bone, I was going to say it starts to become more woven. It starts to resemble more of that spongy bone appearance. That blood vessel is making all those little rods thinner and thinner and thinner compared to step 3. And we've got compact bone getting laid down on the ends. And you end up with your flat bones that form the bones of the skull. Flat bones, if I took any of your cranial bones and sawed right through them, it would look like a whole bunch of spongy bone in the middle, and you have compact bone on either side. Instead of having the long bones with spongy bones on the ends and compact bone in the middle and a medullary cavity, it's just all spongy bone with compact bone on the ends. That's what your flat bones are. Now, Mike, so people that are even harvesting bone marrow, things like that, if they wanted to, they can go into any of these flat bones. There's always going to be spongy bone. There's always going to be red bone marrow in your flat bones. That stays throughout your entire life. Generally, they're not going to go and harvest from your skull, though. Now, some developmental aspects of bones. Your skeleton, as long as everything is healthy and normal, ossifies at a very predictable rate as a fetus. It starts at 8 weeks, and you can follow how much of bone is laid down compared to how much membrane or how much hyaline cartilage is left. Most bones start ossifying, so the process starts about week 8. By week 12, you should be able to see little primary, ossification centers in the middle of the bone. So you should almost see a little bit of bone getting laid down in the center of each of the cartilage-looking bones. And you can even start to see sometimes at week 12 that bone collar forming around the diaphysis. And again, I'm like, for people that are, they're like, I had no idea I was pregnant, and they can want to know how far along they are. I mean, there's other parts they can measure, but they can sit there and look at an ultrasound and look at bones to see how much is ossified and how much isn't yet, and do a pretty predictable how many weeks along. I'm like, it's pretty predictable the whole way along, how long it takes and where the ossification happens. At birth, most bones are well ossified, so you don't have a lot of cartilage left. There's still some bones fused together, things like that, like up in the fontanelles. But most bones are done ossifying. They're bones now versus really, really soft, flexible cartilage. The little part they accept at the epiphyses. Like, you're going to still find some cartilage in the epiphyses. By the age of 25, all bones are done growing. And I'm like, they're not getting longer, you're not getting taller, your feet aren't getting bigger anymore. And I'm like, all bones are completely done ossifying. You shouldn't have that epiphyseal plate anymore. There won't be any cartilage in your bone except on the ends. It will be the epiphyseal line. It's all bone. And it's just a cool picture. 12 weeks. Looks like a little baby. Mm-hmm. I know, that's why it's crazy, because it looks like a little human. You can see every little bone, even though they're not even bones yet. All right, some things that help regulate this whole ossification and bone growth. The biggest one, hormones. The biggest one is your growth hormone. Based on the name, it helps regulate growth. If you're going to grow taller, we need ossification to happen. We need this hormone to help regulate it. So the growth hormone stimulates epiphyseal plate activity in infancy through childhood. So not quite through adolescence. That's the other hormones that start to kick in. So after a baby is born, they look at their, they put them on a little thing and they take how long they are. As the babies get longer and longer and longer, they start walking around and start getting taller and taller and taller as kids. That's really all the responsibility of your growth hormone. Another hormone, the thyroid hormone, regulates how much growth hormone is getting secreted. So growth hormone is just going to cause you to grow. The thyroid hormone is the one that regulates how much. People that are, for people have thyroid problems, they can't regulate their growth hormone. That could either lead to one of two different things. An excessive amount of growth hormone being secreted, which makes it's going to make you grow extremely tall. It's called gigantism. This is the people that end up in the world, the World Guinness Book of World Records where they're like 14 feet tall. That's generally because they had a thyroid problem. Not they had some genetic whatever. They had a thyroid problem. Their thyroid hormone couldn't regulate the growth hormone, and they just had excessive amounts of growth happening in their bones. The opposite is if you have almost no growth hormone. If the thyroid gland is not working properly, it's not saying that growth hormone should be released to cause growth to happen. This causes dwarfism, where the bones do not grow longer. I'm like, they'll just harden right away. They're not going to grow longer. And I'm like, I knew of a student. I'm like, I feel really bad. I'm like, I think he hits 9th grade right now, and he looks like a 2nd grader. He's got a thyroid problem. I'm like, and they didn't know what was going on. They just thought he never hit his growth, never hit a growth spurt yet, and I think they're finally starting to give him growth hormone. Problem with him, growth hormone really makes you taller up until you hit adolescence. Then other hormones take over and cause you to grow taller after that. So I'm not sure if they're going to give him a combination of growth hormone and testosterone to really bump up his height because he looks like a 2nd grader. And he's in, I think, high school this year. Testosterone and estrogen are the 2 sex hormones that's going to take over once you hit adolescence at puberty time and cause you to grow. I'm like, so the growth hormone is still there. It's not, it goes away, but the real hormone that causes you to grow taller once you hit that adolescent part is your sex hormones. So testosterone in males and estrogen in females. Estrogen works faster or sooner than the testosterone does. So around middle schoolish, when everyone's hitting puberty, estrogen kicks in and girls grow taller than boys in middle school because they hit their growth spurt first. And then the testosterone eventually kicks in, and then the males, once they get into high school age, get their growth spurt, and then they get taller than the girls again. That also causes girls to stop growing sooner, too, and males stop growing sooner later. Growth that happens when your testosterone and estrogens kind of level back out, though, at the end of puberty, and your epiphyseal plate closes, and the bones stop growing any taller. Your growth hormone stops. Your testosterone and estrogens are leveled off enough where they're not, huge spikes to cause those growth spurts. Excesses or deficits of any of the hormone causes abnormal growth, either that gigantism or the dwarfism, whether you have too much or not enough. All right, bone homeostasis. So we want new bone as much as possible. We don't want old bones. We recycle the nutrients and the elements in our bone, about 5 to 7% of our mass each week. We are constantly breaking down bone and laying down bone. And I'm like, but I'm saying, every week we recycle about 5 to 7%. We can break some bone down. That calcium and phosphorus and any of the nutrients go right back into the bone to form new bone. And I'm like, so we're just recycling the nutrients there. All together, completely new nutrients, completely new bone, nothing from old bone. Your spongy bone is replaced every 3 to 4 years. Where we've got all new calcium, nothing recycled. All new phosphorus, all new collagen, nothing recycled. About every 3 to 4 years. Compact bone is completely replaced about every 10 years. Takes longer to replace that compact bone. We're recycling those elements, calcium and phosphorus, a lot more. And I'm like, we want to try to maintain it so we can break some down, but we're just going to try to absorb it right back into that bone so it doesn't go anywhere. But completely replace all new calcium, all new phosphorus, all new collagen, everything else in your compact bone about every 10 years. Why we want new bone? Well, older bone starts to become more brittle. Some of the calcium salts start to crystallize. Your bones become brittle, they become fragile, and if you jump or fall or whatever, they can break and fracture more easily. And so we'll talk about remodeling. The more you can make your bones remodel and replace themselves, the faster, the better off you are. Your bones aren't going to be as brittle. They won't break as easily. Now, our bones will remodel and change a little bit in result to stress that you put on bone. It's something that's known as Wolff's Law. Know the law, highlight it, underline it, whatever. Know this law. This is what affects bone width, bone strength, bone remodeling. It's all based on how much stress and pressure you put on your bones. I was like, this explains handedness. How many of you are right-handed? Last night we had everyone. Just 2 left-handed? Andrew? Andrew, you are? Oh, just Abby? Do you have a sibling that's a doctor? Oh. I saw a doctor this weekend. Her last name was Althoff. And I'm like, I forgot to ask. Most of you are right-handed, which means I'm like, you're putting more stress on your hands. Not just the writing all day, but I'm like, this next picture, if you were in tennis, but I'm like, if you're grabbing stuff, if you're holding stuff, if you're picking stuff up, all throughout the day, you're using one hand a whole lot more than the other hand. You're putting extra stress on that bone. The bone doesn't mind that though, and I'm like, it actually, I'm like, it kind of likes it. Because what that's going to do, the more stress you put on bones, and I'm like, the more it realizes, I need to compensate for that extra stress. I'm going to remodel faster, and I'm going to be thicker. And I'm like, so that I've got a strong enough bone to handle whatever you're going to make that bone do. And I'm like, so people that have right hand, that are right-handed or left-handed, either one, those arm bones are going to be thicker and stronger than the opposite arm bones. Curved bones, such as the bones in your ribs that go all the way around, they curve. They are the thickest and the strongest at the curved point versus the straight point. Again, there's extra pressure that happens, becomes more fragile or damageable when you start to curve. Trabeculae, the part in the spongy bone, forms little lines along lines of stress. Like that's having extra support where you have lots of stress in your bone. We end up having really large bony projections anytime you have heavy active muscles attaching. This is one I wish I had a bone right here. All right, on your tibia. Imagine I'm holding a tibia. There's a big, huge bump on the front of it. Do you remember what that's called? Tibial tuberosity. You guys are like, oh, some of you are like, oh, crap. The tibial tuberosity, huge bump on the front of the tibia. That's just not there so that you have something else to memorize. That big, huge bump is one of these large bony projections because you have very active muscles that are attaching to it that allows you to lift your leg up and down. It's because muscles are attaching to it. And I'm like, there's a very specific ligament that even attaches right there. I mean, there's other things that attach there. Do you remember what ligament attaches right there? The patellar ligament attaches. It's one of the things that attaches right at that one part of the tibia. All these little bumps and projections that you have to know in lab, they're not just there for making your life difficult. It's because muscles are attaching. It's very specific muscles attach at these different parts of bones. You're putting pressure on that specific part of the bone compensates, and it adds additional bone tissue there. And I'm like, just to help compensate that extra muscle pulling on it. So people, and I'm like, bones of fetuses and people that are bedridden, that, years and years and years and years, their muscles are not putting any pressure on any of their bones because they're not moving them. Their bones are more featureless. They're not going to have a big, huge, tibial tuberosity because they've never had a muscle pulling on that bone before. And I'm like, so this isn't just talking about someone goes into the doctor, and they're pregnant and they're like, I got to lay in the bed for the next couple weeks. No, and I'm like, these are people that live, they're bedridden for years and years and years. If you don't put that extra pressure on your bone, those little projections are going to start to go away. Same thing, fetuses are not running around working out and doing things like that. They're not going to have those big, huge bony projections yet. Like, so that's why we have all those little bumps and everything else that you guys have to memorize. Muscles are attaching there. And they, form themselves a bump because of different stresses that we're putting on those bones. There's my little picture, like serving arm versus non-serving arm. The serving arm is going to be thicker, stronger. We had extra tissue on the inside. We have extra tissue on the outside. So it helps prevent bone breaks. Now, bone fractures, which is the actual term for saying a bone break. How many of you have had a broken bone? Like half of you. You guys need to be more careful. We had one last night, a pinky. You guys are less safe than my night students. All right, for people that have had bone breaks, I've only broken a toe, nothing too exciting. The first thing they're going to do is try to realign the bones back up. That's the reduction part, is realigning the broken bones together so that they're going to grow back together properly. Now, Mike, there are some people, even my one person last night that broke a pinky, didn't know he broke a pinky finger, didn't have the reduction done, the bones didn't fuse together properly, so it just looks weird. Still works. It just looks weird. Now there's a closed reduction and an open reduction. A closed reduction means a doctor can go in and position the bones back together, and then they can put a caster on it and hold it together. An open reduction means there's no way you can use hands from the outside of the body and reposition the bones back to where they need to go. They surgically go in, open up, move the bones exactly where they need to go, and then pin them or put some type of bracket right there. How many of you have had that happen? The back row. All right, now I gotta know, which bones did you break? Andrew? How? What'd you do? By a car? And you got run over by the tractor itself? Ow! I was going to say, yeah, that's a good thing. Well, glad you're alive. John, what'd you break?
Shattered my elbow from here to here.
And I suppose all the little pieces in there, they kind of have to. Oh, well, I'm glad they didn't. Holy cow. Can you still feel lasting effects of it at all, or no? Everything went back together? As he's writing with his right hand. That's open reduction, when they have to go in and surgically do it. Again, usually that happens, I mean, it depends on which bone is broken, how the bone is broken. I mean, some bones, you know, if here's the top part of the bone, there's the bottom part of the bone, you can have a nice clean break. Well, that's easy to position together. However, when you start getting bones that when they break, sometimes you can have twisting of bones. They don't always, like once you start twisting the bone, they're not always going to line up perfectly if it starts to twist inside the body. What also can happen is, yes, you can start to shatter your bone. So this forms a fragment. And then you might have a fragment down here. And then maybe you have another couple little fragments over here. Once you start getting fragmented bones everywhere, they're going to have to go in and do some type of open reduction to get those fragments back to where they need to go, and then pin and wire everything together so it all stays together as it heals. I should find out, my husband's friend shattered every bone in his foot, all the metacarpals and everything, and he showed pictures. He posted them on Facebook. I should see if I can find those, because then he showed the actual x-rays of all the pins that had to hold it together, and the pins, actually the rods came out of the foot holding it, so it looked really gross, but it looked awesome. That was a total open reduction. Then after they get the bones back into place, then they have the immobilization. They don't want you to move those bones. They want them to heal properly, right exactly where they need to be. That's the immobilization, whether they put a cast on, some type of traction, something just to stop the bones from moving out of their alignment. Now, depending on the break, how severe it is, I mean, some people can break a bone, and really all that's happened is they cracked it. It hasn't broken all the way through. They're not going to go in and do an open, reduction. They'll just put a cast on it and say, be careful while it heals. So depending on the bone, the break severity, which bone is broken, and how old you are, can depend on how long you're in a cast. The older you are, the longer it's going to take to heal. Now, there are 4 main phases or stages of bone repair after you've had a bone break. The very first one is usually the most evident one. If you broke a bone, you have to remember, you've got blood running from the top of the bone all the way to the bottom of the bone through little canals, the central canal, the Herversion canal. You've got blood going through the other direction in the perpendicular, or the perforating or Volkmann's canals. You've got blood all over. And I'm like, you break the bone, you break all those blood vessels with it. So blood is going to leave the blood vessels, and you end up with a big, huge blood clot known as a hematoma. So big, huge blood clot. So wherever you broke that bone, you're going to see lots of swelling because you've got blood forming in that area. It's going to be painful, not just because of a broken bone. You have to remember, all the cells, you've got living cells all over in your bone that are relying on the blood to bring it nutrients and oxygen. You cut off its nutrient and oxygen supply, you now have cells that are dying, and so it becomes very painful. It becomes inflamed because now you've got other things that are going to try to come in and try to get rid of all these dying things. So, very first thing, swollen, painful, inflamed, and you got your big yourself a big blood clot. Now, within the next week, we start to get something known as a fibrocartilaginous callus that forms. And I know this looks like a whole lot. Now, the second stage, you have a fibrocartilaginous callus that forms. We have new capillaries that are going to feed and grow into that big, huge blood clot, the hematoma. So we have new blood vessels, new capillaries going into that hematoma. You have phagocytic cells. These are big eaters. These eating cells that are going to go in and try to get rid of any debris that was there, whether it's some of these dead cells that died, anything else that might have floated into the particular region. They're going to go in and clear it. Fibroblasts, these are fiber building cells. They're going to secrete collagen fibers to span the break. So we're going to have new fibers that are going to sit there and try to connect the two bones together. And again, and I'm like, it's all, collagen fibers. I'm like, this is part of the cartilage that's going to be in here. So you have fibroblasts making collagen fibers. We have cartilage, and we have osteogenic cells that are all beginning the reconstruction of bone. But the first thing that's going to form here is really just a little cartilage, almost plug, that holds the two bone pieces together. Now, what are osteogenic cells? Yeah, they're bone-making cells. So we've got some of these cells in here that's going to try to replace the cartilage we're laying down eventually with some of the bone. So we're going to create cartilage in here, and eventually osteoblasts are going to start coming in and making new bone to replace that cartilage. But the whole repaired part, that whole mass that connects the two bones together, that's your fibrocartilaginous callus. Hold on. So there's your fibrocartilaginous callus. Again, we've got new blood vessels found in the area. You're going to have cartilage even on the outside of bones. And I'm like, it's just that blood, those new capillaries come in and just are laid down cartilage everywhere. Inside the bone, connecting them together, they're going to lay cartilage down on the outside over here. Anything just to try to keep the two bones together. This happens in about the first week after a bone break. Those two bones are connecting back together with cartilage. Now, at this point, you're still in a cast. Why would you not want to take your cast off at this point? Yeah, I mean, it's just cartilage. It's like the cartilage in your ear. Your bones would be floppy back and forth. And I'm like, and you could end up ripping that cartilage callus back apart and starting all over again. So this happens about 1 week. Cartilage fuses, and forms the two bones together. The third step is now we have a bony callus. That cartilage callus that spanned the entire, outside, inside, that spanned that entire width, all that cartilage now turns into spongy bone. That's our third step. So within about 1 week after your bone break, we're now going to start to see some trabeculae that are replacing that cartilage. So eventually that callus, that cartilage, is going to turn into a bony, hard callus of spongy bone. And the replacing of all of that cartilage callus, replacing all of this cartilage callus into all spongy bone, takes somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks, which is approximately the time of what? You're wearing a what? You're wearing a cast. You usually have a cast on for somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks, because it's during that time period that we, made that cartilage callus, and then now we're replacing it with spongy bone. So at 8 weeks, your bones look like this. They're still usually a little bit bigger, a little bit wider right there, because there's some spongy bones sticking out on either sides, and they take your cast off. Now, once they take the cast off, should you go run a marathon on that? No, why not? Yeah, and I'm like, it's just spongy bone. There's no compact bone on the edges yet. And I'm like, it's still not as strong as it was when we first broke it. That gets to be, several months on. And I'm like, that's my last part. I'm like, so after your bony callus forms, now we're going to try to remodel that bony callus, get rid of the spongy bone, replace it with compact bone. That continues for several months after the bone break. So you'll take your cast off at 6 to 8 weeks, your bone's still pretty strong. You can still walk around, you know, if it's a leg. They're not going to want you jumping up and down, though, because that could still take several months for us to replace the spongy bone, that compact bone, and your bone to be back to normal. So any excess material that was on the diaphysis, because there was a little bit of excess material on the diaphysis, that starts to go away. Any excess bone that was hanging out in here, because again, you have spongy bone that goes all the way across. Depending on where this is in the bone break, you may want that as medullary cavity. So we got to get rid of all the extra material. The part that's hanging out on the edges, on the outside, and anything in the middle that we don't want. So we have to get rid of all of that, and we lay down compact bone along the edges to support the long bone shafts. So eventually, your final bone, several months after a break, resembles the original bone and is just as strong. So several months later, you have a completely new bone, compact bone in the edges. You've got a medullary cavity in the middle. If it's in the middle of the bone, it resembles the original bone just as strong. Now, it will still always leave a little bit of mark. This is why if you ever watch the CSI shows and bones, they know exactly where you had bone breaks. There's always going to be a little bit of mark right there. Your bone's still going to be structurally just as strong, but it will still leave a little mark, just almost like a little scar on your bone that's where you had a bone break. So, the 3 steps. First, you have the hematoma. Then it becomes the cartilage. The cartilage is replaced by spongy bone. And then eventually, months later, it's right back to wherever it was before the bone break. Now, some problems that can happen with bone. The big one is osteoporosis. Now, the word osteoporosis just means a group of diseases. There are different types of osteoporosis, different places you find it in the body. We're just going to talk in general. Osteoporosis is a group of diseases in which bone resorption outpaces deposit. So bone gets broken down faster than we can make bone. Now, as we get older, in general, your bone mass does decline naturally. That's naturally. However, if it starts to become excessive or you can't function anymore, that's when we start getting into osteoporosis. Couple places in the body where it seem to be really affected, where we are just breaking down too much bone. The spine and the neck of the femur, and in your vertebrae and your hip. So I've got 2 pictures showing this is spongy bone. You can see normal bone, nice, thick, trabecular rods everywhere. Osteoporotic bone, thinner rods, and the rods that are there are completely full of holes. Like if you jump on that, it can break and shatter in any one of those particular areas. It's very weak. There's not a whole lot to that bone itself. To support the weight that you're going to put on it. That's what happens in the osteoporosis. Now, this is where it sucks today being a female. Risk factors for osteoporosis. Most people that have osteoporosis are middle-aged, postmenopausal women. So between the ages of 60 and 70 years of age, if you're a female, about 30% of us will have osteoporosis. By the time we hit 80, 70% of us will have osteoporosis. Like your bones are going to start to look like that bottom picture. Men can develop osteoporosis. It's not as common. The main reason for women developing osteoporosis, estrogen is a hormone that helps regulate bone mass throughout life. Testosterone is the hormone that helps regulate bone mass throughout life. In females, our estrogen level takes a serious decline after menopause. And so we can't maintain that bone mass. That testosterone in males, it will go on the decline as they get older. However, it's just a slow, gradual decline that, just goes on for the rest of their life. And and it's usually not enough of a decline to cause osteoporosis. Some other risk factors that can put you at risk for osteoporosis, if you have a petite body form, so if you're short, insufficient exercise to stress bones. So if you don't ever go for a walk, you don't ever do any type of exercise whatsoever that you're putting extra weight and pressure on your bones, your bones aren't going to be very thick to begin with. If you have a diet poor in calcium and protein, your bones aren't going to be strong. Smoking damages your bones. It doesn't allow calcium to be uptaken. If you have a hormone-related condition, whether your thyroid's not working correctly, anything with your thyroid stimulating hormones, you don't have enough of it. Diabetes can affect the calcium deposit in your bones. Immobility, if you would be in a wheelchair, the bones of your legs are not getting extra pressure on them. They become osteoporotic and thinner. In males, if they're taking an androgen suppressing drug, which literally means a testosterone suppressing drug, which if they have prostate cancer, testosterone increases the prostate cancer, the division rate. So if they take, almost make them take an anti-testosterone. That's almost like doing like a menopause for the men. If they stop having any testosterone, that causes them to develop osteoporosis. People that have osteoporosis, treatments, calcium and vitamin D supplements. And again, if you take a calcium supplement, they're always going to have vitamin D with it so that you can actually absorb all that calcium. If you have it, they're going to say doing weight-bearing exercise so that your bones remodel faster. Sometimes they do hormone replacement therapy. If what causes osteoporosis is that sharp decline in estrogen, well, then they're like, well, let's just give them more estrogen. And then now they're going to be able to, build their bones back up and keep them strong. In theory, that was an awesome idea. The side effects ran into some problems with that. Postmenopausal women that they started giving estrogen to had a super high increase in risk of heart attacks, stroke, and breast cancer. So then they're like, wow, maybe we can't do that anymore. Now what they're trying to say, instead of actually giving them direct estrogen, is they take estrogenic compounds, which you can find in soy products. So soy milk, soybean anything. And I'm like, that has estrogenic compounds in it that can help mimic the effects of estrogen, but you're not giving yourself huge doses of estrogen anymore. And I'm like, so that seems to be, the best cure right now. However, the best thing to do is not just treat osteoporosis, it's prevent it. So make sure you've got lots of calcium in your diet in your early adulthood. So you go home and drink milk today, and eat some cheese, or just do that. Reduce your carbonated beverage and alcohol consumption, as I have my carbonated beverage. Both of them, carbonated beverages and alcohol, they leach minerals such as calcium and phosphorus out of your bones. Like your bones aren't going to be as strong if you constantly are drinking carbonated beverages and alcohol. Now, problem with alcoholics then. So if you have an alcoholic that that's all they drink all day long, they've got alcohol morning, noon, and night, their bones are not going to be very strong because they don't have calcium getting deposited in their bones and staying there. Now, what happens to alcoholics more than anyone else? What happens to them if they're drunk? What are they going to do? They're going to fall more, which puts them at a huge increase for bone breaks because they're alcoholics and they're drunk and they fall and they've got very brittle bones. It's almost like they have osteoporosis at a really early age. So alcoholics break bones a whole lot more than anyone else does because their bones aren't very strong and they fall. And you should just try to, so reduce those in your diet and do lots of weight-bearing exercise. And like the more weight-bearing exercise, running, walking, anything that's just putting extra weight on your bones, that's going to cause them to remodel faster and they'll be stronger and thicker to begin with. And so the more bone mass you have, the thicker it is, it takes longer for it to break down. And so you got to start the thickest bone possible. Some other age-related changes in bones. These aren't all bad. It's not a complete age sucks. It does, but as you get older, just some bone changes just some changes that happen in your bone as you get older. Children and adolescents, bone formation exceeds bone reabsorption. So your bones are growing in length and width. We're making more bone than we're reabsorbing it. And young adults, end of adolescence around your guys' age, your bones are just kind of maintaining. When we add stuff onto your bone, it's about the exact same stuff we, break down. Your bone mass is staying relatively the same. Your bone density, changes in your bone density over time can be determined by genetics. Now, Mike, so if you've got someone in the family, you know, aunts, uncles, parents, things like that, that have osteoporosis, grandparents, I guess if we go further back, grandparents, great-grandparents that have osteoporosis, it might be a genetic issue. There are some genes that cause you to have a vitamin D deficiency, which means your skin's not going to make as much vitamin D, or you're not going to be absorbed vitamin D. And why is it bad if you don't have vitamin D? You can't absorb the calcium that you eat or drink. And so I'm like, that in itself, it could be a genetic issue that you don't have enough vitamin D, you're not making enough vitamin D, and you can't absorb calcium that's in your diet. After the fourth, you know, beginning in the fourth decade, so about the age of 40 and after, it's all downhill from there. Your bone mass, the mineralization, the adding calcium and phosphorus into your bone, and healing ability all decrease. And so I'm like, you're going to have weaker bones, it's going to take longer to heal if they do break, and the mineralization, adding that calcium into your bone takes longer. What's nice, the bones of the skull do not seem to be affected. I'm like, part of it is, I'm like, they didn't start off as cartilage, they started off as membrane, so they were a completely different type of bone. And so, you know, I'm like, when they were remodeling, they were modeled a little bit different. And it's good. I mean, if your bone mass is going down everywhere, you definitely don't want less bone mass in your skull. Otherwise, one, you know, hit on the head and your head crashes in or caves in. It's not good. So luckily, that's good. And bone loss is greater in whites and in females. A lot of it, again, it has to do with that postmenopause and the estrogen levels. So again, once you hit 40, it's all downhill. I'm not too far away from that, so it's like, yay. Super excited. All right, pull out your note cards. I only have 2 review questions before I review some bones with you. First one, really long. A local coroner determined that the unidentified skeleton found last week was that of a weightlifter because the muscle attachment sites were much thicker than in a normal person. This phenomenon is known as what? And there is no such thing as the orange one, the weightlifter law. It is the Wolff's law. The more stress you put on the bones, the more the bones are going to thicken up. They do use this. And I'm like, even on the show Bones, I love the show Bones. Because it's all on bones. They can look at an unidentified skeleton if they would come across a skeleton and be able to tell lots about a person just based on their bones. They might be able to tell, you know, yeah, that's a weightlifter. Or they might be able to say, you know, this person's in construction or did some type of, you know, heavy labor throughout his life. Because those projections, all the tuberosity, the trochanters, all those things are really thick on the person. They can also look at it and be like, all right, Mike, for someone that's in a wheelchair from waist down, how would their skeleton look different? They would have really thin bones and very featureless bones. You were not going to have huge bumps coming out of the bones on their legs. Their arm bones, though, are going to be very thick. And all of those bumps and tuberosities, you know, the radial tuberosity, all of that are going to be really pronounced. And so you're going to be able to see that just in the bones. So you can tell a lot about a person and their activity just by looking at their bones, and all because of the Wolff's law. And the other one, at what age are nearly all bones completely ossified and all skeletal growth has ended? Yep, when you're 25. Are you guys all 25 yet? Maybe half of you. Oh, let me stop this taping.